Okay, here's what we're doing. I'm going to ask whoever wants to talk about what their group had to say that they found interesting or liked, particularly those things that touched on what gives us hope and what we think we can do to make things better. In the meantime, while people are assembling behind the microphones, I'll ask the panelists who are still here, who are roaming around and listening, to say what they heard. What are the things that they heard that were most interesting to them? Sana, you have something you wanted to say?
So I got to spend a lot of time with one group or more than others. Oh, sorry. And I know some of the conversation, it was a pretty interesting conversation about, mostly with young people, around the role of over-criminalizing kids in schools, in the foster care system. I hope you guys do the better report out than me. Many of them are practitioners, but they see something one of the interesting questions was, there's a threshold where you can overrule the Department of Children and Families' decision if the judge finds an abuse of discretion. So how can you document bias against kids and their families as a form of abuse of discretion? Because that's something that's implicit, that's something internal and intersocial. But it does, in experience, meet that threshold, but how do you prove that? That was an interesting conversation, but also the talk about how the criminal records of parents prevents kids from families being intact, whether it's housing or reunification or where they're placed. But it was a very dynamic group.
It seemed like there was a lot of heat coming out from that corner of the room. Would people want to talk about what their groups talked about and what they found interesting? In which case, Kate, you want to start that ball rolling?
I sure can. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Niemans with the Mental Health Legal Advisors Committee. I had the pleasure of joining a group that, one of the things that I thought was interesting that we talked about was a little bit of what are the outlets for the professionals and the advocates and the activists to talk about their own individual experience, not just the work that they're doing and the people that they're doing it with, but to make sure that we're all, cared for and practicing self-care. And when I say we, I'm specific, I want to connect this back to advocates and activists' own experience of racism. So that's not really my we, but, and the creation of healing spaces for those folks who have experienced that and pathways for them to be discussing that, because it's important to think about this work, I think, holistically. When we're talking about race and racism, and we're talking about how it affects all of us negatively, that is true for both the client populations and patient populations that we work with, but it's also true for the activists and the people who are part of the movement as well. And to not sort of include the care of those individuals is it's not changing. It's not going to change anything for all of us if we're not including those folks too. And another piece that our group talked about was bringing the humanity back into our systems. How do we bring the humanity back into, whether it's our court system? We had a court officer in our group as well as a judge. And so whether it's our court system, whether it's our housing system, whether it's our benefit system, sort of whatever, school systems, how are we bringing, and I'm not saying we had any answers necessarily for that bigger question, but how do we bring the humanity back in? And to some degree, the group was discussing, sometimes it is really about those individual acts. What do I put out as a person out into the world? And if every person in this room is putting that positive spin out into the world, does it lift all of us up? Because there are some folks we may not reach, and there are plenty of people who are not in the room. But these individual ways of sort of making a bigger impact. That's just some of the wonderful things that the people in the group were talking about.
Thank you. That's great. That sounds like a really good discussion. No wonder I saw those heat waves coming up.
Our group talked about, I think, many of those same topics about the lack of humanity sometimes with people who are actually doing their job correctly, whether it's that clinician who misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or there was a prevalence through Cambridge that we have here a chair from CPAC who noticed a prevalence of white children getting diagnosed with ADHD or autism, but then you have the brown and the black kids being diagnosed with the more severe oppositional defiance or other diagnoses. And so one of the solutions that was offered was looking for better data, whether it's the Department of Education or whether it's with the state. Do we have data to show what she is seeing on the grassroots level to see how that can help individual parents who come to this organization looking for help, looking for assistance? Another suggestion was, can that organization provide peer-to-peer assistance so that someone's going in with that family at those meetings at that level? Someone also suggested it may be beneficial, even though a lot of people don't like SROs, maybe you invite the SRO to one of those meetings so that they finally get an understanding and put a face to the name or a problem to the situation or parent. So next time you see that child walking the hallway, you'll know that if you touch him, he's gonna flail his arm. So maybe you don't touch him and you look him in the eye or whatever the situation is. Two of us were discussing what I think, for those who were here yesterday, I was crying when I spoke at the microphone because everything that was talked about yesterday dealt with personal, racial, implicit bias, microaggressions on a daily basis. And we talked about it. We didn't have solutions on how to deal with it. My one suggestion yesterday was therapy. Finding the right therapist, though, is an issue even for us. I thought I wanted a brown therapist. I found myself a great Italian-American therapist, and I'm happy because I had to check my bias at the door because I know I needed that self-care. And we did spend a lot of time with DCF issues, and we need to be more creative with what's in our toolbox. A lot of us here are attorneys, and we feel that that abuse of discretion motion isn't enough. So how do we challenge within the regs of the Department of Children and Family to do a better job and to hold these employees accountable? And that kind of wrapped around today's panel with training. How do we find out if there's panels or commissions or agencies here in Massachusetts that we can reach out to and say, when are you guys going to go into the court systems and do a cultural humility training or an implicit bias training or whatever we can do based on the information we heard today to help these organizations do a better job?
Thank you. There are some agencies that are sort of responsive to that kind of thing. You know, DMH, DYS. It's true. Thank you. I don't see anyone else at microphones. Do the panelists want to contribute anything at this point? I'm surprised. Usually, we've had to say sorry, no more. But is
I'll
there anyone
contribute
else?
from my group.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we had a bang up group over there, over yonder. Talked about lots and lots of really important topics, but there were a few clinicians, but really a range of folks dealing with youth and educational context as well, and then also gang-involved youth on the streets. So it was really informative, a lot of great active listening, but also sharing of important information. I think one major theme was frustration with the gap in services, and how do we provide mental health treatment to people who need it, particularly young people, but also people coming in and out of the system, the correctional system. And then there was also some talk about, we have an opportunity, particularly with students and with folks who are incarcerated, whether it's DYS or in the adult system, of having a captive audience, so to speak, and you can have services provided in one place. And if we can and should get it right for these populations, because it's hard to do that for folks who aren't in those systems, and we at least should get it right in those systems. So we talked about that. We also talked about the importance of data. So it seems like a common theme too. Are the data, if it's already out there, is it publicly accessible, and how do you get it? How do advocates utilize it so that they're tools that we use to get better services for these populations, but also what data are missing, and how do we compel that data so that we have the information that we need to make the case for the population as well that we're not serving. So that was another major theme that came up, and some other things that have already been mentioned came up as well. But the issue of kind of peer mentorship, whether it's for parents or students or adults, and just having somebody there, not necessarily or maybe in addition to a mental health clinician, but having someone there who can really be your support and follow you through that process is incredibly important, and something that I think has been prevalent in other groups as well. And I just want to add one thing to that, is that a client taught me this, who had spent a considerable time in solitary confinement, and he said, you don't learn by sitting in a box by yourself and banging your head against the wall and trying to figure out what you did wrong, especially solitary confinement. That's all you think about is everything that's gone wrong in your life because you have nothing else to do. But you learn by communicating with people and talking with people. Because one of the things that came up too is people who aren't diagnosed and so don't necessarily have a basis for accessing mental health services, but there's clearly still something going on, and so people just need someone to talk to sometimes and talk through their issues, and we're doing less and less talking to each other this day and age. So that was another thing that came up.
Go ahead.
Is it okay?
Hi.
Oh, hi.
So in our group, we talked a lot about just like, what do we do about this huge, overwhelming, ridiculous problem? And we each kind of came to like different answers for ourselves. One person mentioned that just doing something is really important, and each of us have different skills that we bring to the table. So we're each good in our own avenues. Someone else mentioned that it's really easy to get caught up in venting about the problems and harder to get to that action point of what am I actually doing with this. And also I kind of thought about what do we do as far as like, do we tackle the system from within or from the outside? And there were a lot of really helpful responses from the group. It seems like tackling the system from within is very challenging because you have all these forces fighting against you, and at the same time it can also serve some purpose if you're strategic about it. But also, yeah, just trying to unite with people who are like-minded can be important as well. Thinking about it from the micro level of trying to pull apart your own internalized oppression and socialization, while also kind of like zooming out and thinking about how you can affect the system as a whole. And that seems to be a theme with the conference too, is just thinking about the individual level as far as implicit bias, but also thinking systemically as far as all of the issues that need to be broken down. So I really appreciate the aspect of each of us contributing something, because each of us brings different strengths, and hopefully we can all kind of unite forces and do something.
That's great. Thank you very much. Cassandra?
Well, I came back in late. I was at the meter. We had a great group, and we brought up some of the points about communities of color not having anyone come in and deal with trauma that's really real in their communities. A person gets shot or there's gunshots at the school, and how it's become a norm. So they just think that that's the normal things that go on, and it happens and they move on with life and nobody deals with it. If we don't start addressing the trauma in our youth when it happens, I think that's where we begin to see the threads start unraveling. So we talked about that, and I don't know if we had a solution, but we talked about also, I guess, the different cultures, and the police in Worcester saying that there's maybe 30 different languages and dialects, and if someone's in trouble, they can't understand you. If you need a therapist, there's just not enough people that speak your language, that look like you, that know who you are, that can understand you when you're really in need. So how do we change that? How do we get more people to reach out to people that look like their community, that represent their community, that can really speak to the needs of the community so that we can be effective in the work that we do? I don't know. That was some of the stuff.
At the microphone.
Yes, I think our group did talk about most of the issues that were echoed earlier, but however, I need to bring the connection between the schools and the justice system. So someone says that 5% of the schools send 40% of the students to the justice system. So it's a small minority of schools, small percentage of the schools that are sending all those kids into the justice system. So somehow there needs to be more communication and training, as it was echoed, in the schools. And resources, I think somebody mentioned, like the kids are not getting the resources, especially those who speak English as another language. So we need to find some ways to approach, to reach out to that population. I mean, the courts are using interpreters. So right now I'm not in the classroom, so I'm working as a court interpreter. So do we need to reach out to more interpreters to communicate with the parents or with the stakeholders? So last, I think we need communication with the stakeholders. So I live in the community, and I'm seeing that the stakeholders are not engaged into the discourse. So how do we reach out? We need that. We need to reach out to the stakeholders. Many of them come from another culture, so we need to train them. What do we expect from them? What does this culture expect from professionals, from leaders in the community? So somehow the leaders are not involved. So I'm seeing this as a two-way issue. I know there's racism, but the leaders in the communities need to be engaged also, especially in relation to the schools.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Valeria? And then we'll go to Lisa and wrap up. Go ahead.
Actually, this wasn't from our group. I wanted to just take a moment to, I always look around at who hasn't spoken, who has spoken, who is here and who is not here. And I just want to acknowledge, it's wonderful to see my Latin sister here who spoke. I see members of Asian American, Pacific Islander. I want to recognize that we see you and appreciate your presence and wonder whether you want to come forward and say anything to us.
Thank you. Lisa, you had something you wanted to say?
I don't want to cut anybody off.
No, I mean, what you can say that while someone thinks about how they want to respond to what was just said there.
I was excited in the first group I sat with to hear people considering how there's something about American culture which compartmentalizes, silos, and always delegates responsibility for tricky issues to institutions in a way that doesn't adequately serve people with complicated issues. And we had a really interesting conversation about that, as well as how other cultures accommodate more to people with difference than we choose to in the United States, with specific attacks on the coldness of Boston, which as a New Yorker, I found incredibly cold. And I thought New York was supposed to be cold. And the other thing is that we have to maybe recognize that they're equally disruptive forces that are economic or other kinds and other natures, but we tolerate those in ways that we don't tolerate individuals. The third thing we talked about was how part of the problem is that we're constantly looking through the lenses of rights and not obligations. So, I want you to stop. I have a right to be free from any manifestation of your mental health issue on me, but do I have any obligations to you to help you avoid that manifestation or to stop the sources of what's making you mentally ill in the first place, be it racism or exposure to trauma or exposure to the economic inequalities in the United States? So those were really complicated and interesting topics.
On that score, let me say one thing I've had in mind since. Did you have something, Sam? Did you want to say?
You're the first one. You told me to say.
I'm sorry. What?
She went first.
Oh, were you? I'm sorry. Who wants to talk?
You.
Me. All right. All right. Liz had said something earlier about how, a group was talking about the need, how do we meet the need for treatment? And dovetailing with what Lisa was just saying, I was reminded of a conversation I had with somebody who I think probably knows more about what goes on in schools in Massachusetts than anyone else. And we were talking about how do we refer to these kids at school? The schools find so troublesome. And he said, we wouldn't have to worry about that if they were treated with a modicum of respect and dignity. Then we don't have to worry about diagnoses for these kids. So the main thing that we could do to meet the need for treatment is to stop generating it. And I think that's sort of a theme that kind of has run through this event. I'm really grateful for everyone for being here and your heartfelt participation. And thank you.
So I want to repeat that thanks, and I wanted to close with a couple of things. One, to let you know that this entire thing has been videotaped. It will be available on our website, charleshamiltonhouston.org, as will the materials that have been used here. One of the things in our group that I suggested is that one of the things you can do going forward is to think about the things that you heard and saw these last 2 days that you can and should share with others. I think part of the goal of this is to have produced a record that we can use and that goes beyond these last 72 however many hours. The other thing I would like to kind of think about an image, okay? I had a conversation outside yesterday afternoon with somebody who talked about, kind of how do we get more people at the table, right? And that's a theme, and I want us to think about our language and think about whether we can be creative, because I said to her, the problem is we need to get rid of the table, right? And we need to think about the structures that we take for granted, right? Because if we get rid of the table and we're sitting in a circle and we're talking to one another and we're dealing with one another as people without it being mediated by this table, that's part of what we want to do, right? And the other image is this society is built on scarcity, right? So what do? We think about doors, right? We think that white people get to go walk through a door and that door is closed for people of color. That image is really powerful and it's really strong. But the fact of the matter is that that's not what we need to do. We need to tear down the wall that holds up the door, because the wall is what's separating us. And in this society, what we think about is how do we let a few more people in the room? But that's not the issue, right? Because that just perpetuates the exact same structure we have, okay? So I've taken advantage of my opportunity to be here. And the last thing I'll do is I want us to model some behavior here. I want us to pick up our trash. Because I don't know, have you seen, there are people of color who are going to come in here behind you and clean up after you. And it bothers me. So I did it yesterday, right? But I want us to take that as a lesson that we really need to think about how we're moving through space. That's right. So with that, I thank you all for being here.